Hey there, my name is Jasmine Sky, and I am here today with a fun video I've seen around the booktube space. And even though I am an AuthorTube channel, I figured that it might be cool to share some recommendations in a unique format. So today I'm going to do one of those if you like this, then read this video, but I'm going to switch it up a little bit and I'm going to say if you like this YA novel, read this manga. Now, of course, the way these videos work, if you don't know the YA novel that I'm going to mention, but you do know the manga, then it's a recommendation the other way instead. But I'm specifically thinking about this video for those of you who have wanted to get into manga or anime and haven't known where to start. Hopefully, if you know any of these YA novels that I will be using, then that will be a good way for you to know if this manga / the associated anime is a good fit for you. I have 5 recommendations here. That's 5 YA novels into 5 manga, and all but one of the manga do have an associated anime, so if you are interested in watching the anime instead of reading the manga, then you can do that. For me, I primarily read manga nowadays. I don't tend to watch anime as much anymore, so I have all of these physical manga here to show off to you. So without further ado, let's just get right into it and start with my first recommendation, which is if you like Truly Devious by Maureen Johnson, which is a dark detective school story, then you might really like Death Note, which is written by Sugumi Oba, art by Takashi Obata. These two, I think, have a lot of very similar vibes. They have characters who you want to root for, but do things that are at times not rootable or a little bit more despicable. The main character of Truly Devious is more classically a hero than the main character of Death Note. The main character of Death Note is a villain for sure. This is an anti-hero story. This is a fall to darkness story, and it does get a lot darker than Truly Devious. Death Note definitely straddles the line of not actually being a YA story. By straddles the line, I mean like it very quickly devolves into just straight up being an adult story. But this first volume at least does start in high school, and it follows a young man who really wants to be a detective and is extremely intelligent. And this story follows a young woman in a special high school who really wants to be a detective. And so there's a lot of similarities here. And if you like the vibe of Truly Devious, or if you like the vibe of Death Note, because this is a very popular manga / anime, so maybe you have seen this but not yet checked out the Truly Devious series, then I would recommend both of these in conjunction with each other. Next up, I'm going to bring up a YA novel that actually got a lot of inspiration from manga and anime. Julie Kagawa wrote Shadow of the Fox. The Shadow of the Fox trilogy was heavily inspired by anime. The plot of it reads like an anime. The world of it is very typical feudal Japan fantasy, and that's not an insult, because if that's something that you really enjoy, this does have a lot to it that is really, really fun and adventurous. And I had a hard time choosing the anime manga, and I had a hard time choosing the manga that I think best fit this, because there are so many inspirations that are clear within this story that you could watch. But for me, I think the thing that I gravitated most to with this series is that it is a team builder story. It's the story of a young half kitsune, so half fox girl, who basically ends up on this epic quest and teams up with a ninja and a samurai and like a whole host of really interesting and fascinating characters. It's definitely also got, now that I'm like thinking about the team that's built in this first book of this trilogy, it does also very much give me Inuyasha vibes. So if you watched Inuyasha growing up, or if you're looking for older anime to watch, Inuyasha is another great choice. But for me, I think Shadow of the Fox, the combination of the team building vibes and the very wide scope of it, this is a story about an entire kingdom and what's happening with this sort of big event that's coming up. And because of that, the manga that I actually chose that I think if you liked the Shadow of the Fox trilogy, you might really like is One Piece by Ichiro Oda. One Piece has a much larger scale than the Shadow of the Fox trilogy, mostly because it is much longer than a simple YA trilogy. This is epic in the sense of like Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series epic. The adventure that Luffy and his crew go on in One Piece crosses literally so many different kingdoms, so many different political situations, so many different other pirate crews and marine groups and political groups in various areas that they travel to. This is seriously wide scope, but I did really like that about Shadow of the Fox as well, is this very wide scope nature of it. And the other thing that I think connects these two is that they have very serious themes, but the characters are light and fun and sometimes oblivious and naive, but then when push comes to shove, they bring out these really amazing fights and powers and really do what needs to be done. And that is the case in both of these. And I think that if you like that aspect of either one of these, you should read the other one. And you know, just know if you're signing up for One Piece, you're signing up for a legitimate epic. And if you're signing up for Shadow of the Fox, you're signing up for a trilogy. So there you go. The next YA novel is one that I think is a little bit more obscure. It wasn't an Owl Crate box, which is the version that I have. The newest novel by this author has gotten more buzz, so if you liked her newest novel, then I would recommend going back and reading this one, because personally it is my favorite book that she has ever written, and that is The Hearts We Sold by Emily Lloyd Jones. Her newest novel is The Bone Houses, which is more typical medieval dark fantasy. The Hearts We Sold is a modern paranormal fantasy story, but it is a lot darker than you might think it is going into it. And that is why I connect it with the very popular series Puella Magi Madoka Magica, because this thing is not what you expect when you're going in. Now, Madoka Magica is kind of unique in that it was an anime first, and then this is the manga adaptation of the anime. This is in fact the complete story of the first season of Madoka Magica, and it is lovely, but I do think that I would recommend watching this as an anime, unless you really don't want to do that and just want to read it, in which case absolutely you can read it. This is still great, but it was created as an anime first, and the visual media of it and the music score and all of it really adds to the story of Madoka Magica. So yeah, in comparison to like One Piece, wherein I would highly recommend reading it instead, because if you try to watch the One Piece anime at this point, you will be spending the next 3 years watching it. So reading it will probably go faster. The Hearts We Sold, like Madoka Magica, are both stories that make you think that you are in a fun, paranormal, team saves the day from demons story. And then they're not. So that's all I'm gonna say, because I don't wanna spoil either of these, but they're both really good, occasionally very tragic, but overall hopeful tales, and I highly recommend both of these. Now, this next YA book I struggled with because it is by an author who I don't like to support, but a lot of people have read this book, and I do think the book itself still has merits, though we can get into that death of the author situation. But I definitely wanted to use it as an example of a type of story that then the manga is very similar to. So that is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. Bet y'all thought I was gonna bring up a different book. Orson Scott Card, unfortunately, is very homophobic and has made donations to charities that I don't agree with, so I don't like to support him anymore. I have had this copy of Ender's Game since I was a teenager. I had to read it in 8th grade for school, and I fell in love with it, and I read it every single year throughout my teenage years since then. It is a story about acceptance, which makes it very, very strange that the author has gone the way he has. And in fact, Orson Scott Card is a very complicated situation, because a lot of his early books have themes that he himself no longer agrees with. Like, he's literally written a book about a bisexual main character, and then here he is being a homophobic asshole. So anyway, Ender's Game, I'm not encouraging you to read it if you haven't, because I don't want to support Orson Scott Card, though if you do want to read it because the series itself is very good, then go buy it used so you're not giving him any money. That would be my suggestion. But the story of Ender's Game is basically about genius children who are being forced to fight in a war. And the first book primarily is a training story. They're at this military school, they're being forced to battle each other in this simulated training. It's a very fun sort of competition story. It is the story of a main character, Ender, who has to rise from being like the runt to being the leader and things like that. And so if you like that kind of genius children being forced into very difficult situations and coming out on top vibe that Ender's Game has, then I highly recommend The Promised Neverland. Story by Kayu Shizai, art by Posuke Demizu. This is one of the best written manga out there. It's in the vein also of Death Note in the sense of how smart it is, but this one has a very different vibe from Death Note because, like I said, Death Note is a fall to darkness story, and this one is much more of a rising out of the darkness story, kind of similar to Ender's Game, where this is about a bunch of genius children who are in a very terrible situation. They're in an orphanage for gifted children, and in this first volume you figure out what exactly is going on in this orphanage, and then the first major arc of this manga slash anime is the things that come out of that realization. So I don't want to say more than that. Again, don't want to spoil, but this has some very, very good plot twists, just like this one. They're about very smart children that form a group together to beat the adults at their own game, in a sense. So I highly recommend The Promised Neverland, and I really do think you should check out either the manga or the anime, which I do believe only has one season so far. So if you like the story of the anime, then you can continue reading the manga, which has gone on quite a bit past that. Now, the last book I'm going to talk about is a very different vibe from all of the other ones, and that is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Robinson. Enchantment of Ravens is a standalone romantic YA fantasy. It's got depth to it. It's got a little bit of insta-love going on, but then it's not a perfect insta-love relationship. And then there's this element of a fantasy adventure that happens, but in the end of the day, it's just about a young woman who falls in love with a very powerful fae in the case of this, and has to sort of figure out how to grapple with her own humanity versus what is happening in her world. Hopefully I explained that okay. The manga that I think fits this vibe really well is Fiancé of the Wizard by Masaki Kazuka. This really took me by surprise because it, in the same way Enchantment of Ravens did, it's got this, you know, very typical sort of hetero relationship that I don't think I'm gonna like going in that ends up winning me over. Fiancé of the Wizard is about a young noblewoman in this fantasy world who wakes up one day in her childhood with memories of her previous life living in modern day Japan. So it's really interesting because here we have this young girl who has memories of a previous life living in a very different society, and she doesn't really do a ton with those memories. I don't want to give you like the assumption about what the story is going to be. This is not a story about a modern woman making it in a fantasy world. This is a story about a young woman who falls in love with this very powerful wizard in a fantasy world, and how he falls in love with her back because she doesn't behave in a typical way to this world, and how they basically have to navigate their relationship. And this one, again, it took me by surprise. There's some great female friendships in this. There's some great male friendships in this. There's some really good sort of discussions of how to build a healthy relationship. And there's some fun fantasy adventure stuff. And that is what relates it to this in my mind. Again, as is the case with Death Note, this one, and One Piece, I should say, both of those series get perhaps beyond the scope of YA, and this one perhaps as well, though it really doesn't get that far beyond. It starts off a little more YA because they're very young, but then it expands into more adult problems, marital strife, and ways that you develop healthy adult relationships, which is not something you typically see in a YA story because it's an adult story, but it's something that I think teens could still benefit from and really enjoy. So anyway, and that's that. That's my video for today. Hope it was helpful. If you want to see me do a part 2 of this video with some more manga and book related recommendations, I have plenty more on my shelf that I could recommend. So please go ahead and let me know in the comments down below. Leave a like, subscribe, all of that stuff. As always, I have links in my description to causes that need your support, so please check those out. Thank you so very much for watching, and I look forward to chatting with y'all in the comments.